Today we're going to see how to use Spring Boot 3 and Java JDK 20 and set up Amazon SES and send email out with SMTP. All right, let's dive in. One of the first things we'll have to do is set up Amazon Simple Email Service. You can go to your Amazon AWS account and go into the Amazon Simple Email Service. In there, you'll have to configure a couple email addresses. So initially, you'll be in what's called the Sandbox until you get it approved by Amazon. So you'll have to set up a couple email addresses that you want to use to test with. So I have one email address, tom@thomasjconsulting.com. I'm going to use for my from email. And then I have a thomasj200@gmail.com, which I'll use to send messages to. So we'll go through, and I've already created the identity and verified these email addresses. And from there, I can go into my SMTP settings. And with our SMTP settings, I can create the SMTP credentials. And what this will do is actually give me a key and a password to use. And that will be the username for the SMTP and the password for the SMTP. At that point, I can configure that in Spring Boot. I want to use for the host name the email-smtp, whatever my region is, and I have all of my work set up for the US East 1, which is North Virginia. That's where I have my default project set up. And I'm going to use port 587, and I will use TLS, and it will be required on here. Okay, let's dive in and let's create a Spring Boot project for this now. I'm using IntelliJ, and with IntelliJ Ultimate, I can create a project and use the Spring Initializer. So I'm going to call this Spring Boot. SES. And this is going to be Java. The domain is going to be tom.thomasjconsulting. And I will use Oracle JDK 20 for the JDK and the Java runtime. I'm going to create a jar project. I'll go to Next. I'm going to use Spring Boot 3. I want to use Lombok. I'm going to use Spring Web. And I need a couple other components which I'll search for here. I want to use ThymeLeaf as a templating engine. I also want to use Spring Boot Mail. So I'll use the JavaMailSender, and that should give me the Spring Boot starter email. And let's create a project for this. All right, so we quickly created a project, and we have a source folder, main, Java with our Spring Boot application, and we have in our resources directory our application properties. So to start with, I'm going to modify our application properties, and I'm going to set the server port to 8080, which is the default port, but I want to just identify it in here for everyone. Let's go ahead and start this project and make sure the base project starts. I'll enable the Lombok annotation. And we can see the project started on port 8080. Great, that's all I want to do at this point. So now we can take the next step and go in and start adding a controller, because we want to make this a service that someone can call, and that service will then send an email out somewhere. Kind of like a notification service, maybe, if you can think of that. So the first thing we'll do is we'll set up a new package for controllers. And within that, I'm going to set up a new class, and I'm going to call this Email REST Controller. I'll annotate that as a REST controller with @REST controller. And I'll set up a request mapping as well, API/v1. And then in here, I'm going to set up a couple endpoints. So the first endpoint I'll set up is going to be a post mapping. And the first post mapping here I'm going to set up is send simple email. I'm actually going to call this send notification. I will create a method for that, and it will just be a public string send notification, and it will return message queued. Since this is an email service we're going to be creating, we're not positive the email has been sent, so we've just queued the message. So when we send this notification, we're going to need to have a request body, and this is going to be a post, and so we need to have a notification request. So we need to create this object now, and we'll create a model package, and in that I'll create a class for my new request. I added a Lombok in here so I can add my @data, and this will create my getters and setters. I'm going to say private string, and for now it's going to be email private string message. So the purpose of this is to send out a notification to this email address simply of this message. So this will be a very simple service. Okay, we can import this in. So the next thing we need to do is to do something with that. We're going to need a notification or an email service. So let's go through and let's create a service. So create a package for our services, and within that our services, let's create a file. I'm going to call this email service. Okay. And I'll annotate that at service. I might want to do some logging in here. So since I added a Lombok, I can add SL4J. So one of the first things I'm going to want to have in here is a send. I'm going to call that a simple send. And I'm going to have an email and a message. And based on that, I'm going to send something out. So we can go back to our controller and we can bring this in. For right now, I'm just going to do a auto wire for this email service. We'll import this in. Now in the service itself, I'm going to call our simple send, and I have notification request dot get email and notification request get message. All right, so this should get the information that we need to send out a simple notification. So if we go back into our email service, we can see that we have our basic information in here, and I'm going to go ahead and log this, say log info, and I will say simple send email colon parameter message colon parameter, and then I can put in email and message. Okay, so let's go through and let's see if this service works to this point so far. And remember, we set this up for port 8080. So we need to send this It's going to be a post on API v1 send notification. And it's going to have a body of email and message. Okay, so let's go through and let's start this up. And let's run Postman. So on our Postman, we're going to send a notification. And this is going to be a post. So we need to create a body. And this body is going to be of type JSON. So we're going to pass in email. And this is going to be the email that I had verified for in the SES, the Amazon Simple Email Service. And my message this is a message. Okay. And let's go back and let's verify this one more time that the notification request has email and message. So we're up and running. And let's actually send this post. Okay. We got back a 404. I got a typo here. So fix the typo. Now we got a message that says message queued and a 200 back. So I'm optimistic there. Let's go in and see what our log said. Simple send, email, message. This is a message. Great. So it looks like we have our basic API wired up. The next thing we need to do is start a little bit of work to configure the SMTP that we've configured on the SES, the Amazon Simple Email System. So to do that, we need to add some properties in here. And these properties consist of the basic email notifications. And I will drop them in here. So I'll drop these in here. And we have the host, which we got from SES, the port, which we got from SES, the username and password, which we'll have to put in there. So I'm not going to share this with the whole world. What I'm going to do is in my IDE, I'm going to load those from my home directory. So this is what will get checked in, but I'll actually have another set of properties which get loaded in. So I'm going to open up a terminal here and go into my home directory. I'm going to create a file, Spring Boot SES .application.properties. Now in this file, I'm going to add in our application properties. And then I can go through and modify this as needed. Okay, so we've gone through and we added an application parameter, command line, spring.config.location to my home directory / spring boot ses.application.properties. And we can start up okay with that. So now we have our application properties all set up and it's externalized. This is a great start. So now that we have the basic information to actually start sending emails, and we've also added it in our POM file because we did that during the Spring Boot initializer. So we have the starter mail in here. We can actually see if we can send a message. So our next step is in our email service. Let's see if we can actually send an email. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to wrap everything in a try catch, and we're just going to globally catch everything. We're going to log this with SL4J. And if we get an error, we're just going to say exception e.getMessage. So kind of a catch-all error trapping for now. The first thing we need to do is get access to a email sender. And that should all be set up as part of the Spring Boot configuration, part of the simple starter classes. So we need to get a JavaMailSender. And in doing that, we may get an error here. And if we get an error there, we can quickly go through and say that this is part of Spring Boot. But if we don't get an error, if you don't get an error on your IDE, we don't have to worry about it. We're going to auto wire this in. And we can see we do in fact get an error here. So this is actually provided by Spring Boot. The IDE doesn't know about it. I'm going to add this in required equals false so that we don't get that little error in the IDE. So now that we have this, we can take the next step and we need to start building on this email sender. The first thing we need to do is get a MIME message holder. And this is going to facilitate what we do with things. And eventually, we're going to actually send out that message. So we're going to build it, and then we're going to send it. But there's a couple things we have to do during this process. It's not quite this simple. I need to change the name of this, and we'll call this on the input output message. Okay. Actually, let's call it email message. Okay. So once we actually create the MIME type, we need to go through and start setting some basic options on here. And Spring Boot has a helper that we can use for this. And in this helper, we can actually start setting information in here to include the from. And I said I had 2 email addresses right now. So right now, this is my from email, a to email, a test subject, and then the text. And right now, the text is actually going to be this email message. So we'll put that in there. And then options, so we can send this as an HTML or not. In this case, I'm setting this as the HTML message. In the old days, a lot of email did not get processed through HTML. Now it does. So that's my go-to and default method now. Okay, and I'm going to put a log message that says email sent. So as we come down, I'm going to say simple mail, email process, that's our input, and then I'm going to say simple mail, email sent when I think it's been sent. But in reality, that's not sent, that's queued. Okay, so let's go through and let's see if this works. Our application starts up. And let's go back and actually try to send a message now. Took a few seconds, but it did come back. And we did get our message queued. So let's go through and check my email and see what we have over there. I can see in my email that I got a new message. It says my email address. Let's open that up. And this is the message that was sent. So it looks like our basic notification does in fact work. Let's take a couple look at things. The email address that I'm sending it to is not being used yet. that's actually going to be the to email address. So let's call this to email address. And then let's pass that in into the to email address. And we need a subject. So right now we just have a message. So let's pass in a subject as well. We'll pass that in and print it out as a parameter. So let's add that to our request as well. So now we have an email subject and a message. And we notice here that we have hard-coded our from email and the name. Let's go through and put that in our property files. We can clean that up real quick here. So I'm going to add in here a property, private string from email. Private string from, I'm going to call it name. Okay, so we parameterize those, and let's go add that into the properties. And I'm going to say email. So let's call this from email. I'm going to call this from name. There we go. So to map these in here, we can go into the service now, and we can use the value annotation. And in here, we'll put a dollar open bracket, and then the reference from the property files. This will be from name. Okay, so that should clean that up, and we now do not have anything hard-coded in here. So let's go through and try this once again. We'll start this up. We're getting an error here. We're getting an error on the types. We need to send a new type in here. We now need to send the subject. So let's add this in here as well. There we go. And let's start this up now. Okay. And now on our JSON for our post, we need to add subject. I'm going to say critical notification. Let's send this out. Took 3.5 seconds. Okay, says it's sent. And let's go check our email. Notification. This is a message. So this looks good. So far, I'm happy with the progress. One thing I'm not happy with is when I send the notification, it takes a while to come back. There's no reason for that. we can actually add in a couple things. And on Spring Boot, we can enable some async processing. And let's go into our application, our Spring Boot application. Let's add an annotation to enable async. Okay. And now, once we've done that, we can actually go into our service. For our service here, we're sending data out, and we're really not returning anything. So I can add in here at async. Let's stop this. Let's restart it. Let's go back to my Postman. It was taken 3.63 seconds before. And I'm going to say critical notification 2. Let's see how long this takes. Oh, 125 milliseconds. Let's try it again. Let's change it to notification 3. Ah, 4 milliseconds. Okay, so now we can see that by adding that in there, it's significantly faster. And if we go back over to email, we can see that we in fact got the notifications. So even though it takes a second or 2 or 3 to queue them and process them, life is good. We don't have to worry about that. So let's take the next step and let's think about, what do we need to do in email other than just sending out these basic emails? Well, you might want to have some more formatted information. You might want to have a service that sends out more information. So let's take a thought of maybe it's a new user and we want to send them a welcome to our site. And in doing so, we want to have a service to send information out to them, maybe our product offerings, for example. So I have a teaching company. I teach classes. Maybe I want to say, thank you for signing up, and here are some of the classes. Then maybe provide a link to the classes. That sounds great. We can actually do that. So I added in the initial project ThymeLeaf, if you recall. So we have ThymeLeaf in our POM file. We can take advantage of the ThymeLeaf, and to do that, we need to create a new backend service. Most importantly, we need to add some configuration classes for ThymeLeaf. So I'll add another package here called config. And then we need to go through and actually configure ThymeLeaf. And I'm just going to take a big jump on this and create this class and paste in some code. I'll make the code available on my GitHub. This is going to be a configuration class. And in this configuration class, I'm going to create a bean. In this bean, it will reference the Spring template engine. Let's import that. And then we need to add a method here for email template resolver. And that's kind of the important meat and potatoes. In this resolver, what we're going to do is reference our templates and that they're HTML and that our template mode is HTML. And that we're not going to cache these, so every time we try to create these, we'll create a new one each time. That's really the only thing we have to do to set up our templates. And we notice that in our sources directory, we have a template folder already that was created whenever our Spring Initializer. And in that, I'm going to create a new folder called email. Emails, plural. Okay, so this is where our emails are going to be. And in there, we can create a very simple template. Let's call this a new customer. I'm just going to use the HTML file, new customer. And that created a new customer.html file. And in here, let's use this as our template to start with. I'm going to do a couple things here. And I'm going to add in some reference for ThymeLeaf. Okay. So we have some namespace information for ThymeLeaf. We have a title. And in this title right here, I'm just going to call this new user email. And then we can start actually using some ThymeLeaf information. For this user to start with, I'm just going to display his name. And I'm going to say hi to him. So I'm not going to get heavy into ThymeLeaf, but what we can do with ThymeLeaf is send in a parameter, in this case name, and then we can use that. So let's see how we can quickly get this all set up and make it work. Normally we would have in here a div and then a span, and we're going to use a th text to put his name in there, and then we would have a span in the div. So that I don't put the span in here, I'm going to use a th remove and remove this tag. So it just has a div, hi, and the name. So that looks good. Let's go into our email REST controller, and we created a notification. Let's also create something to use ThymeLeaf, and we're going to call this send HTML email. So send HTML email is going to be the endpoint. We'll set the method of the same name. And this is not going to be a notification request. This is going to be a send HTML email request. Okay, which does not exist yet. So we will have to go create that. Let's go create that in our models. So just like before, we're going to use @data in here. And to start with, we need a name. So we're just going to create a name, but we need to find out who to send it to. So we also need to have the email. We kind of need to have a subject. Yeah, I think we can start with that, because this is going to be based off a template. So in here, we'll also need to have private string template name. That's going to be the template we use. And right now we only have one template, new customer.html. So I will hard code that in here. New customer.html. Okay, so now that we have this, we can take the next step. In our REST controller, import this in here. Now we're not going to do a simple send. We're going to have an HTML send. So we still need to get the email. We still need to get the subject, but there's more information we need to get. So for right now, we're going to send the whole request. So on our service side, we can create this new class. And we know we need to send in this parameter into it. So now we have the basic information for the send email. Now on the service, we know that we have the email, subject, and name. And that's not going to be passed in. So let's just copy this same code for now from the simple send, because this will look similar to it. Not exactly the same. In our simple send, there's a lot of things that are not defined. So right now, I'm just going to put in the values. We'll get the email. We'll get the subject. And I'm going to, for this, give it the template name. So now down here, We're getting the email. We're getting the subject. Now this is a little more complicated because it's not a simple text HTML. It's actually going to be an HTML string. Okay, where are we going to get that HTML string from? This is where the ThymeLeaf is going to come in. So in our service, when we call this, we have the capability of creating a ThymeLeaf context, and that ThymeLeaf context allows us to hold various properties here. And for now, we had one property in our template for name, and let's go through and actually put that variable in here in these properties. And then what we'll do is we'll take the context and we'll set to those properties. So this is a ThymeLeaf context. Properties to show up in template. After stored in context. So now we store it in the context. We have our helper variables, which we stored up here. And now we can actually create our HTML from our template engine. But we don't have the template engine defined yet. So again, that's already configured through Spring Boot. And when we set up our ThymeLeaf config, we set up the ThymeLeaf template engine so we can leverage that. And we can leverage that with an auto wire value. And now we have a reference to the template engine. So now we will call the template engine with the emails/newcustomer.html, but we know that we actually have that name stored, so we can call our request and get our template name. So from this, we should be able to make a call here, and let's just have some interesting things printed out here. Before I go to send it, let's do a log info, and I'm just going to print out the HTML. And let's do that before we actually try to send it. So we'll comment this out. So let's start this up. And now we need to go through and create a new post because our new endpoint is send HTML email. So let's go over to our Postman again. Let's create this in here as well. And we are now at send HTML. We need to create a body. And this body needs to conform to the shape that we created for the HTML request. So that's an email, subject, and name. Email, subject, welcome new customer, and a name. Great. And we could optionally put in a template name. But for right now, I'm not going to do that. So let's see what happens here. Message queued. That's good. And what do we have over here? We have our basic header information. Notice it does not have all the namespace for the ThymeLeaf. It has a basic head, then it has a body. And remember, the spans that we had in here are not included in here because we said remove. So we have a div, hi, and then we have a span, but we don't have that span. If we were to put a span in here and we wanted to do some styling, then we wouldn't remove this tag in here. Okay, so it seems to work. Let's go through our service now and let's remove these two lines that we commented out. And let's see if we can restart this service. And let's see if we can send this message. Notice this took 3 seconds, but it did say the message was queued. So one thing that we also need to do is we added async up here on the simple send. We need to add the async down here as well. Okay, now let's go check our email. It says, welcome new customer. Hi, Tom J. So all the information that was sent is actually in here. I think this is very good. I'm optimistic that we're on a good path here. So maybe a little bit more advanced information. We talked about the possibility of having offerings. So maybe on this email service, I want to send out additional information. I'm going to have, right now it defaults to the new customer template, but maybe I want to have a new customer plus template. So I'll create a new template in here. I'm going to call this new customer plus template. Okay. And I'm actually going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to copy in a template, which I've already worked on a little bit. It actually has in here name, offerings, and each offering has a name and a link. So I can go ahead and add these in here. What we will have in here is in the request, I will add in here a list of offerings. And these will actually be a list of an offer. So we need to create an offer in here in our model. And what does an offer look like? It has a ID, a string, and a link. Sounds pretty simple. So now we can send in an offer in our post. So let's go through and see what offerings look like for our post. So this is an array. So each one is going to have an ID. It's going to have a name, learn Java. It's going to have a link. Where's the best place to learn Java? https://www.google.com. All right, so that's one offering. We'll copy this one and paste it, and paste it again. We'll say this is offering 2, offering 3. We'll say learn Spring Boot, learn SES, Amazon SES. Here we go. Okay, so now we have additional information, and that will come through in the offerings. How do we expose this in here? So our template string was not part of this. We'll add this in here now, template name, and our template name that we created was new customer plus. New customer plus.html. New customer plus.html. And then we can actually go through here now in our email service, and we're sending in a handful of parameters. Specifically, we have the name that we put in. We're going to bring in here our HTML, send HTML request. and we'll get the name. And the next thing that we want to do is we kind of need to take the offerings. In this case, I'm going to get offerings. So what we're going to do in here is on our new customer plus, we're going to print the name out just like before, but we're going to use the offerings. Actually, it's current offerings. So let's change this to offerings. Okay, so we're going to take offerings, loop over it, just call that offer, and for each offer, we're going to print out the name, offer name, and we're going to print a link to check it out of the actual link. Okay, let's actually go through and see if this will work. This will give us a little bit more advanced, and there's a little bit of colors and styling in here as well. Okay, the code compiles. That's a good sign. Let's see if our Postman post works. Okay, it says message queued. And now it said that the email was sent out or queued. But what does this look like? Oh, now interesting. Remember our for each in here? Now we have for our unordered list, we had a for each in here, an each loop. We created an li, yep, learn Java, and a link. Learn Spring Boot and a link. Learn Amazon SES and a link. I'm very happy that that's working, but let's go through and see what our email really looks like. We have another message. Let's see what it looks like. Oh, look at this nice message. Thomas J. Consulting. Hi, Tommy. Thanks for being a user today. Check out our education content, Java, Learn Spring Boot, etc. And if I click on one of these, it takes me to Google. There you have it. We've quickly set up most of the information that we need to send this out. We set up some Postmans to send data. We set the name to Tommy, and we can actually see that. If we change that to Tommy J and send this out, we should be able to go back and see that in our email. Here it says Tommy J. So great. I'm excited. It looks like we have a whole bunch of stuff up and running. I hope you've enjoyed this class. I've tried to show you some tips and tricks to set up Spring Boot 3.0 with Java JDK 2.0, so JDK 20, setting up a basic REST controller, setting up some models, sending in a request, doing some logging using SL4J, sending some simple email using SMTP, using an email setup using Amazon SES, simple email service, and then sending a more complicated email in HTML. And the HTML uses table-based outputs. If we look at our more advanced, we'll see that we use tables and such in there. Why are we using tables? Because that's a preferred method for sending emails. So if you look at HTML emails, you'll see that the styles need to be inlined. You need to use tables, etc., etc. So basic old-fashioned HTML. So you've seen how we could take a template and use ThymeLeaf to process the template, the HTML template. Otherwise, you'd have to have a whole bunch of code and it will look real nasty. This way, your graphic designers or email designers or system can create the template. The template can then be used based on what you send in. I can specify, a new customer plus or just a new customer or whatever type of template you want. So you can specify multiple templates. You could even put the templates in a database if you wanted to. So there's a lot of complicated things you could do. Other things you could do on this service is you can manage what email was queued, and then later on a process could check SES or your email service to see about people unsubscribing or opting out or bounce rates so you can start backing out email users if they're, if you send an emails and they haven't opened it or responded within a period of time. You could put unsubscribe links in your templates, as you should. You can track that through this service or another service. So there's all sorts of benefits you can do. I hope I've tried to enlighten you and show you a little bit of what you can do with the SES and with SMTP, the Spring Starter email, Spring Starter ThymeLeaf, and of course Lombok. Lombok for the @data and Lombok for the SL4J logging. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know if you have any questions. Please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.